And welcome, folks. My name is Dominic Rollins, and when I'm not sort of hanging out with UMD and facilitating a session during Career Week, I serve as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Dalton School, a progressive independent school in New York City. And before serving in that role, I served as the Chief Diversity Officer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I completed my PhD at the University of Maryland in Higher Education Administration with a dissertation study that focused on how Black male administrators navigate race and racism in the academy. I'm a 2017 graduate. Not sure if anyone on the call today was walking around campus at that point in time, studying something, whether it be an undergrad or graduate degree, but possibly we crossed paths. So at the invitation of the Alumni Association, I am here to present some thoughts and ideas regarding how we facilitate inclusive workplaces in an inclusive climate. It's something that I literally rack my brain on and facilitate on all the time, trying to help organizations, particularly schools, universities, move the needle regarding their workplaces. And thinking about that for not only the students who go there, but also the people who obviously work there. For me, if we are able to create a thriving and inclusive workplace for our employees, the folks that we serve, in the case of education, students, but in other sectors, it'd be the client or others, will also thrive. So as a heads up, I have a slide deck that will support my comments today. I also will have 2 different breakout rooms for us. Not sure what the format may have been on other sessions earlier this week and how much you were asked to engage, but I don't think we get very far in this work of inclusivity if we ourselves aren't using our words and talking it through. And so there'll be a breakout session sort of at the beginning of the hour and then one towards the end. I have us slated for about an hour together, but I've held closer to 90 minutes. And so we'll be able to facilitate a little bit of a Q&A that might go over the 12 to 1 o'clock hour. Obviously, do what you need to do for your schedule. And you have to roll off the call at some point, no worries at all. That said, I'm going to go ahead and get this slide deck up and get us started. Okay. So virtual housekeeping, Steve mentioned a little bit of this, but please go ahead and mute yourself when you're not speaking. If you can make sure your name is shown, that'd be awesome, helpful for me calling on you, acknowledging you when needed. And if you're able to turn your camera on, that'd be great. Obviously having people's faces in help with facilitating a little bit of connection and community. If you're not able because of whatever you got going on, no worries. And then to the extent that you would like to, we'll be using the chat to engage material. You can ask questions. If you need to private message me for a question, that's totally fine. Our intentions for our time. First up, we want to reflect on the kind of professional community that is personally significant. And the reason that this is an intention is because I believe that we say some things about inclusive workplaces and what they might mean. And I think it's helpful if we are personally clear on that. And the reason I think this is helpful is because we then get to move out of our own sort of power, influence, even status within our workplace to try to create and facilitate a community that is good for us and good for others. Then concretely, I want to identify 4 facilitators of an inclusive workplace climate for our teams. And this is coming out of some professional work and research of Lisa Nihil, who's also actually a graduate of the University of Maryland, and she's on the faculty at Cornell in industrial and labor relations. I'm taking and borrowing from her work and want to identify some facilitators of an inclusive workplace with her work and identify 4 leadership behaviors that help shape inclusive workplaces. And then I'll close this out with a brief breakout that's helping to vision just some action steps in future conversations. One of the things I think is important in this, particularly if you do not have leadership responsibility and have direct control over shaping a workplace, is your ability to be able to have the conversations that move in that way. and helping others to think about it who might have some of that responsibility and power. So here in a moment, I'm going to have you into a first breakout room. When you're in that breakout room, I actually ask that you introduce yourself. So who are you, your pronouns, and when you graduated, just because that's helpful in our alum community. And then I would like for you to be in these questions. What kind of professional or work community do you thrive in? So just describe it, whether it is a description like it's open, it's honest, it's one where folks are focused, it's one where I can be my authentic self. Whatever words come to mind, would like you to describe it. And then for you, what is hard about being in community with people who are different from you at work? And so some of us may have multiple communities we're a part of, our social worlds with friends and family and things that we have commitments to outside of work, and then work. And if we are fortunate, we work at a place that does include people that are different from us. And I'm positing that sometimes that's hard. And I want you to sort of talk about and express what sometimes is hard about being in community with people who are different from you at work. And then what kind of professional work community do you want to have? This is identifying a little bit of the gap. What's the thing that doesn't exist for you that you would like to see be a part of it? The purpose of this sort of reflection discussion is just to anchor us in some thoughts regarding what it could mean for it to be more inclusive based on our current experience and based on our own desires. So I'm going to stop share and I'll go ahead and pull these questions out of my slide deck and put them in the chat so that you're able to take them into breakout. Breakout is going to be random. You'll be with this group just one other time towards the end of our session. So questions are in, and we're going to go ahead and have breakout groups that have about 5 people in them, recognizing that some people may be in or out. It's hard to know. So your 5 may materially be a 3 if some folks are literally just listening in. But I'm going to go ahead and create those now and open them up. And you'll be in for about 7 to 10 minutes or so. For those that do have videos on and are with me, thumbs up just if you're good with those instructions.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it, Jeanette.
Will the questions be in our breakout rooms or?
So can you confirm that you see them in the chat for me?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah, yep. And that chat should follow you into your breakout. Awesome. Okay. And open. And Linda, if you're here, you can let me know if you need some assistance in getting to a breakout room. If you're just listening in, you're welcome. Oh, you're good. Great. Great. I'm going to put into the chat 2 questions that I would like to get a few share outs on in the large group before I get back into the slide deck to add some more information and content. And so the 2 to drill down to is just what kind of professional work community do you want to have? And then this question, which is just an interpretation based on the previous, I didn't ask this in the small group, but I'm asking it now. What kind of community is necessary to do the work that you set out to do? And so when you think about what your organization, what your team sets out to do, what its mission, vision, values are, what kind of community is necessary? I'm curious if I can get a few folks, either based on a reflection of what you shared in the small group or just something new to offer up here in our large group. Anyone?
I would say I want an environment where I can be myself and that values diversity. Um, I mean, that's why even though I graduated in 2013, I still keep coming up to campus for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and Indaba and stuff like that, even though I'm not working right now.
Sure. So a community where you can be yourself, where diversity is valued, right? That is a part of what we do, how we are, almost like the DNA of a place. Thanks, Jessica.
Um, I was gonna say, just we mentioned in our small group, and I'm sorry, Janie, that you didn't have enough time to talk. But just that we talked about transparency, and making sure that people are open to talking about issues when they arise, and just general openness and kind of that sense of like everybody's currently learning at the same time, and not being judgmental of each other, but just knowing that it's constantly evolving, and it's a journey that we're all on.
So this openness, a characteristic, like there's openness, there's transparency, there's a desire. And Julia, I hear you also sort of implicating that when stuff comes up that we need to talk about, which I think is an evolution, and part of the evolution of our workplaces. Once upon a time, there was a lot of compartmentalizing regarding work. You don't talk about these other things, it's only the things on work. And I believe as we begin to spend more time at work and have more investment in work, that there's also a need for work to be a space and place where other things get talked about. Also because those other things impact me, right? And so stuff in the world impacts my ability to show up, be fully in at work. Am I able to talk about that? Is that a part of our climate? Maybe one more?
I was a part of Julia's group, so I echo everything she said, especially where in my field of work, really understanding everyone's backgrounds, not only the people I work with, but I do immigration law. So understanding different people from all over the country and people's backgrounds, and that can be anything from how they speak or what they are saying, and just again the understanding the inclusivity is necessary, and not being able to address certain things is definitely frustrating.
Thank you, Stephanie. The part of the reason that I start in this place is because there's a value proposition to having an inclusive work environment. And there is what our research would say about it, what it does in terms of how people feel, how they're able to contribute. And what I'm finding is that there aren't enough workplaces where people just articulate what it is that they want. Right. So if we collectively as a team, whatever our team is, say what it is that we want and why that's important to us and the kind of environment and the kind of community that we want to have, then we get clear on where we need to move to. And it's not this thing that the research is saying or that a best practice is saying. It's actually the thing that we ourselves are saying that it is that we want for ourselves in terms of how we are doing what we do. The reason I also ask the question is, what does your work necessitate? Is because beyond our own personal desires, the outcomes of our work might require that we have a community where we can. So Stephanie brings in the example of immigration law. Like, you probably can't be in immigration law and talking about what it means to be an immigrant to the United States, particularly, and not talk about self. Like like your work necessitates it. Yet, if we haven't gotten clear as immigration lawyers, if you will, making this up, Stephanie, right? If we haven't gotten clear that is important because our work necessitates it, then we wouldn't be bringing it in. And I think that's a starting place when we start the conversations around workplace inclusion is like, what does our work require? And what is it that we want? The human beings here, like nothing outside of ourselves, but the people that are here. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to get into some of those components, because I think when you bring together this idea of what it is that the people want, what it is that the work requires, with the components of an inclusive workplace and some facilitators, bringing those things together positions you or anyone in a way to advance it somewhat. And that's the whole point of the session, for how do we like think and reflect on the ways that we can advance our workplaces to be a bit more inclusive. All right, let me share screen again and get back into the slide deck. Okay, so I want to start with organizational climate for inclusion. And the reason I'm starting with this is because I just want to make sure we understand sort of what we're talking about when we talk about climate. We talk often about culture, and culture generally for organizations is like big. And then climate is the way that that culture gets actualized. And climate can vary within an organization. You know, and you get this felt sense across different teams. I mean, especially if you're in a workplace that's like 50 people or more, because you know that when you're like with IT, that climate feels different than probably when you're with HR, which might feel different than like people who are delivering programs. Organizational climate is the way that people experience the work environment. Questions like, what is it like to work there? How do individuals feel operating? How do business conditions, management decisions, how does that affect the general mood? You know, climate gets a little more specific than culture. Culture might sound like, oh, we have an open culture. And then climate would be like, yeah, that open culture manifests in the way that people are talking to one another. They talk about their family, they talk about what they do on the weekends. And that's how we know that the climate actually is sort of supporting this open culture. Climate also has a strategic focus. And so when we begin to think about it for inclusion, it's about the perceptions of the policy, procedures. It's about the perceptions of management and regarding inclusion. So when we think about the organizational climate for inclusion, it's the way that I see climate sort of happening that does or doesn't facilitate inclusion. So does a policy, for instance, on leave when someone has a new child joining their family, does that facilitate inclusion? Do our practices around pay like facilitate inclusion? And I get a sense of the climate, you know, through people that I interact with, but I also get a sense of the climate through the policies that govern how I would behave and the practices that say what I can and cannot do. The pursuit of inclusion for us has been an interesting one. And I'm going to show some images that helps to like illustrate this. So in our history of the United States, we started with a lot of spaces by policy, practice, and law that had some people in and some people out. And we all know that there were literally jobs that some people were allowed to do and some people were not allowed to do. Or they were only allowed to do for other folk in other communities. Right? We moved a little bit to say, okay, well, we can have some more folks in, but as you are in, you will be relegated to one particular aspect of this place, or maybe one particular aspect of jobs. So you weren't all the way in, right? If I will give you a concrete example around sex or gender, but I don't want to conflate them. So, you know, sex, thinking about women in the workplace, you know, history tells us that the women in the workplace for a lot of corporate jobs, business jobs, started out as secretary, right? And that would have been the role in this larger sort of, you know, construct of a business, right? And then we move and we're like, okay, we're getting better at this. You get to be wherever, right? And that varies across a lot of organizations. A question I have is, what's wrong even with the last picture, the last illustration? What's the problem with it? If anything, I think there's one. I'm curious. Anyone can come off mic and give me a shout on what you think is an issue with that, still with the last one.
This is Deborah. I think in some ways that last picture doesn't exactly show inclusion to, we look for inclusion in the larger group, but we also need to feel a basis of connection to something. And the last one tends to just show sort of everyone's just thrown out there. Everything is helter skelter. There's no, I guess I would say, organization, which is part of, I guess, inclusion. So you almost want to see not the first one that shows here's this group and everyone else is excluded. And then the second one shows there are two groups, but they're still separated. You almost want to see, such as when I do GIS, that intersection of circles. So that here you are in this environmental realm, here's another environmental realm, but here's where we come together. And so then within those intersecting circles of differences, we find inclusion.
So right now, there's no relationship even like in the illustration among these dots, right? So like, how included are we if we're all just sort of in? That's definitely a way that the illustration could be better. And also, I think, connected to our workplaces, right? So there's nothing actually facilitating inclusion. You just put people in, right? You just had them, go from outside to inside, concentrated to now you're inside mixing about. But like, is that really inclusion? Another piece here is there's still a circle. There's still something to be in and something to be out, right? Now, for our workplaces, something to be in, kind of makes sense. It's defined, right? There are people that work for us. There are people who do not work for us. But a question does sort of really regard, like, how structured is that circle? What does it take to get in? Am I automatically in when I'm hired, or would I still start on the outside and there's something for me to get inside of? And the other here is these fuchsia colored dots. So one of the things that the fuchsia colored dots have been able to do since we've always been pursuing inclusion is create and maintain norms and conditions. So this illustration doesn't really shift or change norms or conditions if we take it like historically, that the fuchsia dots have created the structure, they're inside. Okay, they stay inside, they've let some folks in. Okay, they stay inside. And in so doing have maintained status, right? And I think that's important. That's important to really understanding how inclusion is like happening. There's an element of status in our workplaces.
Hey, Dominic, I have a question before we move off of that slide.
Absolutely, go for it.
When your flow.
No, go for it, Maya.
But the way you worded it, when I was thinking about what's different and what's changing, I like the circle as the company. Like I see that as, okay, the circle's my workplace. But what I was thinking is a couple of those dots probably would have to be outside the circle, because at the end of the day, not everyone is able to change their behaviors to create a true inclusive workplace. And so I think you have to sometimes move on, and then this circle is no longer the right place for those people to be. And so I think they may not be the fuchsia dots. There could be some yellow, green, blue dots also that aren't great at it. But I do think highlighting that sometimes you can't get everyone to the future state that where you want to be, and being okay with that is something that I think is important, at least with the struggles that I'm happening right now.
Yeah. So part of what I hear you saying is like, as we have this evolution, like who will be on board? Because some folks might believe that we should be at circle number one, right?
Yeah, number to get stuff done, like you
right,
just move
right,
on and
right,
go.
right. And what I appreciate about you bringing that in, Maya, is the pursuit of inclusion for our workplaces particularly has elevated a call to understand culture and how we are with one another. And that hasn't always been true about the workplace. Like 20 or 30 years ago, we didn't care about the conditions of the experience for people. It was just get the work done. And there's evidence of this. We had no engagement survey 20 years ago. Engagement didn't exist. Here's the job, sort of get it done. And I would say that didn't benefit everyone or didn't disadvantage everyone in the same way, right? So we know that the workplace was built with particular folks in mind, and certain people got a chance to build it. So when we go to measure something like engagement, I expect for some folks for whom the workplace has been built for to like probably be deeply engaged, and for those for whom it wasn't built for, like their engagement is going to like not be as great. But to the point that Maya is making, as we move this along, there are some folk for whom the idea that we would even be attentive to inclusion or to how folks are in is foreign. And this is I think a broader sort of broader shaping of like just workplace. Like if you were to study sort of like how workplace has changed, what we have had attention to, you can see it in the building out of HR, you can see it in the building out of learning and development, you can see it built out in a couple different ways that just give you evidence of the evolution of it, which does sort of blend a bit with this idea of status. And I think status also connects to the previous slide in terms of the evolution of inclusion, to sort of who's in. I'm defining status here as the relative social, professional, or other standing of someone or something, right? And we all have status in a variety of ways. We can make meaning and assess and think about our status like in the world, and we can think about it at work. And there's certain markers, right? Like our titles at work is a marker of status, and then people relate into us via our titles. Right? We also know that our social identities confer some sort of status, and that is as a result of a world that we've inherited that is in fact unequal. Right? So I know that in the world, I have a little more status and or social identity power, so to speak, being in a male body. And I know that white folk have more status being white, not inherent, right? There's nothing inherent about it, but we have assigned it meaning. And we've had patterns of treatment that help us to understand what the status is. The reason that status becomes important in the workplace is that if we want an inclusive environment, we actually have to ensure that status doesn't mean anything or doesn't mean anything more than it should. Right? So the status of me being a director might need to mean something for me making decisions, but it probably doesn't have to mean anything in terms of my voice weighing the day in a discussion. Right? And this is where our workplaces oftentimes don't do enough to really mitigate status, either status conferred by virtue of title and responsibilities inside the workplace, and or status that's conferred and is like coming over from like how we are in the world, that's defined outside of the workplace and inside the workplace. When employees perceive that their social or identity group memberships impacts their status at work, they don't believe in workplace inclusion efforts. They think it's a farce because they have evidence to show that the thing you're going for, this inclusion thing that's a pursuit of yours, this policy, it actually, I see all these other ways that it's not playing out because of the status that people have. Again, whether it's a status title-wise or their status with one of their social identity groups.
Can I ask a clarifying question
Of course, go for it, Jeanette.
on that prior slide?
Yep.
Where you say that group members are perceived and impacted their status, is it adverse impact that you're talking about? Or
Yeah,
any-
and
Okay.
yeah. And so I purposely, I appreciate the question because I purposely did not write it only as adverse or negative, because inclusion should mean that all of us get to be in. And if I believe that even someone's social identity group is having them be in more, right, then I'm not going to believe in this because it could be because it's not amounting to it actually being inclusive and fair. I mean, coming with inclusive is fair. So I most certainly believe that if it's having an adverse impact, folks definitely. But even if they see it having a positive sort of impact, because here's the thing, there's very little positive impact for someone that probably isn't having negative or adverse impact for someone else when we're in fact trying to be all in, like, and we're trying to be sort of fair, right? So, if I made that concrete, the promotion that could be on the basis of, a mix of, "Oh, you do a good job and identity, and that's like great, but what does that mean for us being inclusive? That might benefit me, but what does that mean for sort of everyone else? Um, and so generally, to your question, Jeanette, is most certainly the folk for whom their social identity group membership is having an adverse impact for them. But I wrote that to ensure that we could see it from both sides, because if in fact it is having sort of a positive impact for some, it still is an arbitrary thing, which would discount any effort for it to be inclusive and be fair and be equitable. Thanks for asking that clarifying. It's a I appreciate it because when I wrote it, I was attentive to that and thinking about how we would think about it together. So if that's true, and the if here is like we have this evolution of what inclusion looks like, and we have status as being an issue, right? Then what do we do? So what do we do to be able to facilitate an inclusive climate? And I think that these are things that anyone gets to do, and I think that those who have leadership responsibility or managerial responsibility get to do even more. Professor Lisa Nihil from Cornell talks about this a lot. And I'm sort of borrowing from her work, amplifying it because I think it's really smart and it's accurate with what I've seen as a practitioner doing this. So share goals and vision. One of the number one reasons why people at times don't feel included in their workplace is because their work often isn't included. Like the very thing that they're doing is getting marginalized, pushed to the sidelines. I personally feel more included when I see my work being included, when I see the very contributions that I'm making being included. How do you do that? You have shared goals and vision, meaning that a whole team has an understanding of where we're going. And as a result of the understanding of where we're going, individuals get to see their work represented. But if I see my work as marginal, then I'm probably going to feel like I'm marginal a little bit because this is the thing that I'm doing every single day. And, depending on the configuration of a team and its goals, it might be a challenge to really get a vision in alignment that speaks to everyone. But I think it's important because people will see that the very thing that they're showing up to do every single day is a part of something that is larger. And that helps with communicating that you are in fact included. Team insight. I love this because this is the rationale for going a bit deeper with the people that we work with. And a lot of times folks are like, well, I don't understand. Like, I don't need to know anything about the other people that I work with. Like, just come in and do your jobs, right? The reason that team insight is important is because we all hold biased, stereotypical beliefs about other human beings. If you take that as true, then those biased and stereotypical beliefs will in fact inform how you think about that person and their work. When we begin to get to know people more and better, we will have personalized understandings that help us to shed some of the bias and stereotypical beliefs that we might have. And that is going to have us be more inclusive. That's going to have us feel more included. That's going to actually have us work a little bit better together. Now, I will say that Team Insight probably has a disproportionate positive benefit for groups of people who are often stereotyped and biased against, but that it's universal. You know, no one, like nobody gets to show up to the team meeting and be free of some version of judgment because we all have some stuff. And whether it's signaled by the way they talk, whether it's signaled by sort of attention to detail, whether it's signaled by academic pedigree, it will fire off for all of us probably some bias, some stereotypical thoughts, some assumptions. And it isn't until, and we all have experienced this one-on-one. You've experienced like that moment where you've been working with someone and you learn a little bit more and you're like, oh my gosh, I thought this and now I think this. It deepens the connection. And what that deepened connection does is it actually just has them and you be more in. I emphasize this because I think there is a bit of discord around to what extent do I need to be personally connected. And I think having a rationale that, you know, a little more of a personalized understanding of each other combats bias, stereotypes, and assumptions, which enables us to do better work together. Encouraging environment. So this is all about like the environment. We got to have conditions that allow me to like articulate dissent, contribute my ideas freely, right? And so we have to model it. We have to like name that that's a thing that we want. That like we have to have an environment where folks can say something that's different than what the boss said. If there's never a dissenting opinion on your team, I'm going to say you don't have an encouraging environment. I'm not going to say that no one has a dissenting opinion. You know, like 5 human beings getting together to talk about a new idea, like not all 5 of them can agree. And if you, in the context of your work on a team, never hear someone say something that is dissent, disagreement, or different than what everyone else has said, that to me is evidence that you probably don't have an environment where they are encouraged to dissent, which then we're not all in, we're not inclusive. If you believe that all 5 folks are like agreeing all the time, ooh, show me the family for which that's true. Show me the friends. I mean, I can point to so many places where there are thicker relationships, and that's not true, right? And then last is team terms, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper here. This is the how will we be with each other? How will we engage? So where I think we have the biggest ROI for inclusive climate and teams is when we determine how we will be together. Now, Lisa Nihil talks about this as a team charter. You could Google team charter and come up with some stuff. I talk about this in my work often as norms, ground rules, right? But it formally will establish specific ways and processes that team members can use to be able to be together. She identifies 4 that I think are great. I think the team charter conversation or the group norms conversation can go in a lot of directions. But primarily, if you are getting input and participation for all team members, so you're answering the question like, how will we get input from everyone? We are prioritizing the fact that we want input from everyone. What will be our process for doing that? And it's establishing that so that we have a mechanism. Mechanism might be like, look, we actually, you know, pass around a virtual piece of paper and everyone gets to contribute like at least one idea to the thing. Or we set up like, we email a discussion question. Now someone's collecting all of that before we get into the agenda item, but it's being clear and descriptive and specific about how you'll get input. The next one, ensuring team members build constructively on ideas. So we really quickly will talk about how things won't work, we aren't as quickly to talk about how things will work. And so this part of the team charter or the group norms is like, look, do we have a way to build? What that might sound like is when we have group discussions as a team, after someone presents an idea, we need to have at least 3 people build on it before we get a new idea. And it's just literally saying, like, we're going to make sure we carve out the time to be constructive. Well, if I knew that there was a way that my team members would build on the thing that I would say, I would probably be more apt to share more often than not. But if it's left to like a free for all, then my idea might not be worth sharing because people are just going to tear it down. And people might not be tearing it down because they're negative. People might be tearing it down because we have a highly analytical team who really like pokes flaws to make sure, well, is that the first place we have to go? And is that actually facilitating inclusion? And then the last one, and this is the most important one, I think, make decisions. So like teams want to know, people where they work want to know, like, how will we make decisions? Especially if I have a role where I'm supposed to generate information. Because if I'm generating information that's used to make decisions, but then I don't know where I fit in making decisions, discouraging. I don't feel included. So Professor Nihil suggests that these are 4 like places to start, or to be really concrete in your team charter or your group norms conversation. I agree, and would say you could use a group norms conversation to talk about a lot of things that are germane to your team, that feel specific to your team. Like, how will we handle this? Because when folks have those as terms, it's an agreement that this will be the process. And what that means is that you can't use status to circumvent what we agreed to that we will do. So put differently, I might have a title that enables me to make a decision unilaterally, but because as a team, we have said, this is how we'll go about making decisions, I won't use my status in that way. And if I do, I've gone outside of our group norms. So there got to be some sort of accountability for that. And what this does is it helps people with various power in the team or organization understand how to relate and how to be in. In the absence of norms, we rely on status or power, which is not shared or equal. And there are reasons for which is not shared or equal in our workplace by virtue of our hierarchy. There are also other reasons by virtue of our social identities which don't make any sense and shouldn't be the case, right? So it shouldn't be the case that, like, for instance, a white man in the organization who happens to be close with, you know, a white man who's the boss just gets to like circumvent a process and inform a decision, right? That happens. And, you know, one might ask, is that explicitly about race? And my answer would be, given the work I do, yes. I understand how some people sometimes don't see it as about race, but when we have some of these terms in place, we minimize the possibility of that happening.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Go for it. Yep.
Are you defining, do you see a difference between inclusion and belonging, or do you see them as the same?
Great question. And I do see a distinction. And the distinction that I see between inclusion and belonging, particularly in our workplaces, is that belonging takes inclusion and it is more personalized, and it cares even more about the felt sense in a place. I think you can have inclusion without having belonging. And I think when people talk about not feeling like they belong, they are talking about this essence of connectivity that would have them be reflected, feel included, connected too often. That inclusion may not get to. Now, I do think if you do inclusion well, people can feel like they belong. But I think there are ways to do inclusion that would not get at belonging. I think the reason that belonging is important is because those who feel like they belong give of themselves to the organization and feel like that's reciprocated in ways that are that are great, that feel really good. And you miss out on some of that if you aren't engendering that. I would not say that I designed sort of this presentation nor researched for this in a way that was about belonging.
Okay. Okay, gotcha. Great. I agree with what you said too.
Thank you. So I realized I had more words than I thought, and we're coming up on one. I got until 1:30. Folks, stay on or roll off as you need to. I only have probably 2 more slides, one of which is going to get you to discuss. So I want to talk about leader behaviors that promote inclusion. And I think that these be done wherever you are in the organization, right? I don't necessarily believe that this is about a leadership role or manager. And so first up is assessing or being perceptive of the inclusiveness of the team's climate. So are you in fact aware of how inclusive or not? And here's the thing, when folks, and this is, I think, highly true of folks who have been trained in something technical or trained to be about the business, that when they've come up to the managerial ranks, they weren't trained necessarily in managing people or being attentive to people. They were trained to like do this thing, and they do that really well. And we reward that with sort of manager responsibility, but sometimes they're not. Folks aren't necessarily paying attention to like what's up with the team. Who's in, who's not in, who's speaking, who's not speaking. That is a necessary ingredient to promoting inclusion, is just really being able to be perceptive of it. I think those of us who are often not in are really perceptive of it. It's like I can see it because it's impacting me. Being able to say what your expectations are about behaviors that are expected to promote inclusion. Now, obviously, if you're a manager or official leader titled in an organization, you get to have expectations about behaviors. I think whenever you're on a work group, you know, you're working with someone, you get to have expectations about behavior, right? And so that might sound like I'm expecting that we all have an opportunity to voice our opinion on this before we make a decision. Is that something that this work group is going to be able to do, right? And in so doing, you're promoting inclusion. And when you're participating in a process, whatever it is at work, like I think as a peer, you get to do that, you get to say that. Obviously, role modeling, and each of us get to role model in any way, shape, or form within our spaces. One of the ways that I personally do it often is asking for the opinion of people who have not participated. It's a basic facilitation move, and it's one that is modeling. I'm paying attention to who has not participated here, and I'm asking, you know, for them to participate if they would like to be able to, you know, participate. And then reinforcing desired inclusive behaviors, which may lean more towards, you know, someone that is a manager or have a official leadership role. But I think there are ways in which you get to either amplify or express gratitude or just notice inclusive behaviors. And those 3 things, amplifying, expressing gratitude, or noticing, will help to reinforce, right? You know, it's like I appreciated when, you know, the email about such and such asked for all of our opinions. Oh, okay, that's a thing that we should be doing. We should be asking for everyone's opinion. It sounds basic, but each of these are kind of meta that helps for others to see what it means to enact an inclusive environment. Okay, I am going to, let's see where we're at. Okay, cool. Actually, what I'll do is I'm going to stop share because we've come up to the hour, and I most certainly still have, but I won't send folks. I guess I was really ambitious and also excited. I won't send folks back into a breakout room. What I'll do is I'll actually pull what the discussion questions were and just open it up for us to like have a chat. I've appreciated the questions that have come in as I've been going through the material, and welcome sort of any more. And I'll do that in a way to sort of close us out. As I do that, I'll read to you what the questions would have been if we were going back into that small group. So which of the 4 facilitators of an inclusive work environment could you lead, start, or enact in your workplace? So that slide that was about the shared vision, that slide about team charter, like which of those things could you do? How would a team charter or group norms conversation be received in your workplace? So for some workplaces, that might feel weird to them, given what the culture is. And some other workplaces, it might get welcomed. Which leader behavior are you already doing? Which do you need to start doing? And just sort of exploring that. Those are the questions that I would have sent you into a small group on. We can answer any of those, or with our remaining time, we can just be in an open conversation about the material that I've shared today.
Personally, I know what you're talking about because I was a sociology major when I was at Maryland about status and all that stuff. But one thing I still see in today's society is thinking that people with disabilities are just those with physical disabilities and not necessarily the ones that you can't see. So a lot of times, even still to this day, I have gotten judged about my disabilities because they're not visible disabilities that you can see. And I'm sorry to say, I had professors tell me that they didn't expect me to make it through their class, or they expected me to be in a wheelchair because of being registered with disability support services when I was at Maryland. And I get judged like that all the time by people, even if they don't say it, because you can't see my disabilities. And one thing I still think Maryland needs to teach people is how to do the accommodations in the workplace. Nobody teaches you how to transition your accommodations in college to accommodations in the workplace. And if people knew that, I think it would make it easier for both leaders and the people in the team when it came for working with people with disabilities in the workplace.
Thanks, Jessica, for sharing that. And I have a couple thoughts there. So one of which, when I think about the workplace and the team charter conversation, one of the questions that I would have folks sort of talk about is, so how will we handle and manage our differences? People often think that our differences either they don't matter, that they aren't showing up, and or it's not the thing that we can talk about. And unfortunately, I believe that the legal realm has made the real conversation regarding differences, how they manifest, a hard one. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that hard, because we have them. There are ways in which we are different, and our differences do sort of have an impact, or I should better say, interact with our work environment, right? And that interaction has to be both managed and supported, in order for it to be thriving for everyone, right? And that's one, like, a high level note from what you're saying, because I don't actually think that happens. And then to the point that you're making, it definitely is not happening regarding disability, right? So of all the things with which we may have comfort and facility to talk about, disability is the thing that we are often the least comfortable and the least knowledgeable being able to talk about and discuss. And then furthering that idea that our colleges and universities have a responsibility to better articulate and support, like, what that looks like, navigating the workplace, for the workplace and for the person that has a disability, what that navigation looks like. Others?
So one thing that stuck with me is like your discussion of like being a leader, and when someone becomes a manager, they're taught like this is how you handle the job, but not managing people and understanding that. What do you have any advice for those of us that maybe aren't managers and are experiencing like difficulties with managers who don't know like the idea? I'm sure they understand diversity inclusion on the surface, but not how to actually like make changes. I feel like a lot of my coworkers and I are doing the best we can to like call attention to necessary issues, but I don't know if there's like particular strategies without like overstepping and trying to manage our managers.
Yeah. And so I have a couple, one of which is I love a good pilot. Like, as a manager, how do I say no to the thing that my team wants to try on? We just want to pilot. It's also less threatening. It's in the possibility space. And so whatever thing is like currently an issue that you are trying to manage up on, does the solution live in a pilot? Can we just try out doing X? Right? And that the trying out to do X, I believe, will have a benefit for everyone. Right? So you're situating a solution as a possibility that will have like high return. And what that does, what it in theory should do, is it should draw a manager's attention to something that like they may not have noticed and give a runway to a solution that isn't hopefully threatening. So what's the thing that we want to like try on? And what's the thing that we want to try on that I may also be willing as a staff person to lead? And I think you get to do this like with very small things. Like I just want to try on a new decision-making protocol. So, at our next staff meeting, I'm willing to like research it, like grab it, like familiarize myself with it. And can we just test this out? Just see what it does? I think that is a way, and it when articulated as having a benefit for the team, then this ain't about you, manager, and it might not be about me personally. It's about us. And so one way I would say is offering up sort of the pilot, right, and being able to try on a new idea, and really making it like low stakes, sort of low risk. I think one of the things that managers sometimes struggle with, is this idea that like when we make a decision that has an impact on the entire team, like are we setting precedent? Is this going to be the way we're going to do it for forever, right? Like is there a budget for, like, it's all these other like high stakes implications that are fair to be considering, but might not be necessary for us just to try on something new.
Thank you. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with that one. So definitely.
Can I offer a suggestion too?
Yeah, please.
I think it's also, because I think what Dominic said is great. I would also offer that help the manager see how they would benefit from it, because they're always asking what's in it for them. So for example, if you're working in a unit, a sales unit, and you want to expand your outreach to a new customer base, and you don't have proper representation within your group to be able to penetrate that particular market, helping them understand the connection between diversifying the group and having somebody who might have roots or connections to that growing market will get them excited about, hey, I can pilot this, I can explore it, and this might be something that's beneficial. So what's in it for them? They're always going to be looking at what's in it for me, and how can I control my risk?
I appreciate that so much, Jeanette. And one of the ways that it gets talked about in the space of race and racism, which it is a lane of mine when I'm thinking about inclusion, interest convergence coming out of critical race theory, right? And so the idea of where interests converge, and if you are able to identify that, which is just important, right? Like, as much as I want to believe in the moral compass and the altruism and the good, I tell you one place I believe in is at work, right? At work, folks about the business. And so if that's true, I do have to find something that's going to converge with my interests and your interests, and probably also the interests of the bottom line. But if you wanted something to sort of Google and think about that, like has implications around dismantling racism and implications around like how to move things forward generally, interest convergence would be it.
Thank you both.
Yeah. We'll take time for maybe one or two more The last mighty 13 hanging in, appreciate it. As folks think, I will also pull what was going to be sort of a future discussion questions that I was going to ask you to reflect on as a result of the session. I'll go ahead and pull those into the chat as well.
So this is Deborah. Concerning the entire presentation is about inclusion. How has anyone dealt with, or perhaps if they have, when the supervisor doesn't share the top-down ideas or plans that you're supposed to be reporting, which for me, I find difficulty with, because that's like the primary thing. We may not meet as a team regularly, which would be desirable, that at least once a month, and obviously this last year has thrown everything out of whack. But in my particular job as a physical scientist for the Naval Oceanographic Office at Stennis Space Center, we have people coming and going. There are people on deployment out in the ocean collecting data. We have people going off on business meetings. So often we don't have everybody there, but for those that are there, it would be nice, you know, to have the supervisor say, this is what we need to accomplish during this next 30 days, this next 90 days. But for me in particular, since I'm not out in the location where the majority of the division work, because they're in a warehouse, a mini warehouse type environment, is what is everybody responsible for? So that as I do my work, I know maybe I don't always have to reach to or through the supervisor. I just need to know who in particular has this on their plate for work. So what is your or anybody's thoughts on that?
Yeah, Deborah, there are a couple elements here, and one of which is, so part of making inclusive environments and moving in that way, we're talking about organizational change. We're literally trying to get an organization that was one way to change to be another way. And so when we're trying to do organizational change, then we do have to evaluate how centralized or diffuse the organization is in order to enact that change. So part of what you're saying, Deborah, is like, I'm working in an organization that's diffuse, right? And amplified by the pandemic when we physically can't come together. So we got some people over here doing this. We got some people over here doing this. We got some people that are checking in just monthly, quarterly, yearly. And the diffuseness of an organization makes it hard to do change. It also makes it hard to have anchor points. It makes it hard to come back to the mission and the values. It makes it hard to come back to, you know, what is our roadmap? So to combat the challenge that comes along with being diffuse and making change is that we have to get more discrete. Right. So in organizations that are really centralized, we don't have to be as discrete. It's helpful to be discrete and specific, but like, we're top down. CEO has said this. We have a way to implement it across staff meetings and across business meetings, unit meetings, and it will continue to flow. We now, in your organization, Deborah, got to account for the kind of change that we want and like map that onto the way that employees are actually experiencing the organization. And so if I'm experiencing the organization like quarterly because I'm out in the field, then I got to have goals and targets that match how I'm actually engaging. And leaders have to think about it in that way. We might have an overarching sort of direction, but we can't have a specific approach for a field scientist that is the same as the approach for the person working HR in the central office. And so with that in mind, that's a bit of what has to get thought about, you know, for the leadership team that might want to move this forward. Another thing that I heard you say that I'll give you my interpretation of it, and it might not be accurate, but it's registered for me, which was, you know, I don't have a supervisor that's on board. So we got a top down sort of, this is where we're headed, but in the middle, I got a supervisor who's like not headed in that way. And then what do I do? And part of what one does in that regard is really, I think, getting clear on your own sphere of influence and finding out the place, like, so what can we agree on at least? So at least me and my supervisor can agree on this. At least me and my supervisor sees this as the goal. So I think sometimes I or we get stuck in the place of like, they're not on board, and that feels writ large. Okay, reframe. What are they on board with? Oh, they're on board with producing these kinds of results. Okay, well, getting these kinds of results may require these things. Or they're on board with moving in this general direction, but not this specific direction.
It's not so much and not on board probably as a lack of communication, where this person is an engineer, but he is a supervisor, and prioritizing anything as far as responses to an individual's training, or that will almost at times be overlooked to the point that it's forgotten about, that there's a deadline, that a response is needed.
Sure.
But also it's the fact of just communicating from their level down. I see it with, unfortunately, the department head above, that we, as my department, never hear from that person, unlike other department heads that we've had. But then neither do I see the big picture, both from my division and what my division director's needs are for, let's say, this next year, but then also where does that fit in with the department's plan? So their communication is something I would say I have not difficulty with, but I would like to see the larger plan shared more. I don't need to know the details, but it helps a person to know that if you need to restructure or include more information or do something different during a particular year, because here's the overall plan, then you can start to readjust yourself
Absolutely.
in relationship to that. But when you don't see that
The
plan
plan,
at
yep.
all, then you can't do that.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, as you say it, and I will make this sort of the final comment and go ahead and wrap this up. As you say that, I actually know right now many organizations are struggling with this, and part of the struggle is that, you know, the last year pandemic and racial justice movement has surfaced a lot that folks weren't ready to plan for. Or vision for, and some people don't have an actual vision for it. And in the void, they aren't communicating much of anything, let alone communicating something really specific about where we're headed. I, in my own organization, as a person sort of charged with this work, have also struggled with the, like, what is it that we need to be communicating? How do we articulate the plan? You know, what are we saying is the plan when we're in a moment of like data collection and assessing? Or do I know what the plan is? Because the call right now is to like dismantle systemic racism. Well, I ain't figured out the plan for that. So it is not by any means, Deborah, to make an excuse. I actually think the dynamic that comes up often is when leaders don't have a plan, they also don't know what to communicate in the void. And some folks, depending on how they have become a professional in their work and in their training, in their education, may not have had literally communication be at the centerfold of what it means to lead an organization. And I think that's actually one of the keys, is that communication is so important to leading orgs, regardless of what you do. Because people want to know where they're at. People want to know what's on the horizon. And often we leave a lot to interpretation that actually has to be explicitly shared.
Dominic, do you mind if can I offer her a couple of suggestions from an HR perspective? Do you mind?
Go for it. Not at all.
One of the things to consider is that this person may not have all of the answers and may be just as flustered as you. So I would suggest, if you haven't already, to just invite them to a conversation, to share your concern and offer your assistance to be able to help. to be able to help perhaps disseminate some of that information because they may just be overwhelmed. Oftentimes that truly is the case because things are just moving and changing so fast. And there may be some tools, maybe shared Google file or a SharePoint that they can post the information out so that people can access it so it doesn't create a whole new task for them to have to monitor. So, you think about ways that you can help, reach out to them and have the conversation, and then make sure you approach them from a helpful perspective, and that might help move this along.
Thank you, Jeanette. I actually did that more than a year ago when I transitioned to this new division and initiated the idea of a shared calendar on which everybody can put their planned vacation time to show, in our case, who's in the office, if you're going out on survey, what period of time you're going to be gone. And the one person who really doesn't use it is the supervisor, even though I sent it to him a couple of times to share the calendar, and hopefully he has looked at it, but I on my own automatically, as I'll see things from different division members, I add it since I started the calendar. But so I started some things and tried some things, and I think I just need to, as you said, try a new conversation and see if I can get him to share with me even his report up to the weekly report up to the department head. And for me, in part, this is important because I'm sort of maintaining an overall balance sheet for his finance and budget for the year. And so it also helps me then see too, like, something was done since I've been on survey for 2.5 months and then vacation and still teleworking, where I didn't even know we had some operations ongoing locally, and those changes until he made a slight mention in a call this week. And it's like a little summary, would help. And maybe if I could see that weekly department report, then maybe I will be able to keep up on ideas.